In the last video, we have seen how in the introduction Deleuze finds two perspectives on repetition, one static, the other dynamic. This ambiguous situation was due to the failure of representation and the fact that Platonism, which historically and conceptually conceives the framework for representation, imposes an ontological division between eternal essences and contingent phenomena. So Platonism fails to seize the essence of change or difference because it subordinates change to eternity. But why does this subordination lead to the failure of representation? As we will see in this video, the problem lies in the Aristotelian categories, and we will see how Deleuze solves this complex problem by using a concept, the univocity of being, that comes from a minoritarian current in the history of philosophy. Let's begin with the obvious question. Why is this chapter called Difference in Itself? The in itself, in a transcendental tradition inaugurated by Kant, designates what a thing is, independently from experience. It's the most general possible state of a thing, its essence, and as such it cannot be known, since knowledge must come from experience. It may sound strange that Deleuze chooses this expression since it's an offshoot of Platonism, but precisely he does so because he has something in mind, to reverse our usual conception of knowledge, and in particular our knowledge of difference. Classically, philosophers try to grasp the concept of difference by comparing two things, for example the moment before and the moment after something is changed. The comparison of the two would allow them to seize difference, they think. But this is not the case. It only gives what Deleuze calls a conceptual difference, or a difference without concept, a fixed image of something that changes. That's why we say that in Platonism the dynamic is subordinated to the static, appearances to essences. But of course this does not do. So at the end of the introduction, Deleuze asks the following question. What is the concept of difference, one which is not reducible to simple conceptual difference, but demands its own idea, its own singularity at the level of ideas? Deleuze reveals the necessity to change the meaning of the in itself, at least in regards to the concept of difference. Rather than presenting the in itself as the most general concept, he presents it as a singularity, an idea with a capital I, that is something that is not just descriptive or representative, but that has a creative power. And what singular difference creates is repetition, which is why Deleuze immediately asks this second question. What is the essence of repetition, one which is not reducible to difference without concept and cannot be confused with the apparent character of objects represented by the same concept, but bears witness to singularity as a power of ideas? The new understanding of difference in itself that we're looking for is going to constitute the essence of repetition. But it is a very strange essence indeed, not an abstract one, but one which is going to do something. As he says again on the same page, the meeting between these two notions, difference and repetition, can no longer be assumed. It must come about as a result of interferences and intersections between these two lines, one concerning the essence of repetition, the other the idea of difference. Notice how Deleuze's lexicon here becomes kinetic, which signals that, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche before him, he is going to put metaphysics in motion. This may sound abstract, but it's a giant step in our understanding of difference. It's like watching a still picture becoming mobile. The points of intersection to be found will form a rhythm, the fundamental tempo of this chapter, and there's three main ones: individuation, ontology, and the history of philosophy. As they resonate with each other to create the line of the text, we discover the full scope of the reversal operated by Deleuze. Rather than presupposing a constituted individual who studies the history of philosophy in order to extract abstract ontological essences, eternal truths, he shows how, with the help of the history of philosophy, a concrete ontological power of genesis can unleash a process of individuation. It's a complete reversal of what it means to think. It's also a dangerous process, monstrous as Deleuze says, as it engages life itself. The singular concept of difference, like a monster of the depth, is going to unleash a storm of catastrophes in the form of dissolved identities. Deleuze's prose here is almost Gothic. When the ground rises to the surface, the human face decomposes in this mirror in which both determinations and the indeterminate combine in a single determination which makes the difference. How faces in such a mirror are distorted. This is, to use Nietzsche's famous image, what happens when we gaze into the abyss and the abyss gazes back into us. Any form of identity disappears. Change or difference is liberated, it is made, but at the same time the eye grasps in horror its ambiguous nature. Referring back to Kant, Deleuze shows how the asymmetric process that is implied in this great reversal fundamentally fractures the eye. The singular idea of difference must be made, but when difference is made, I cannot represent my own actions as coming from me. I is another, Deleuze says, quoting the French literary genius Arthur Rimbaud. The abyss appears not in spite of, but because of Platonism and representation as its ultimate consequence, which calls for this great reversal. So Deleuze engages in a deeper analysis of representation in order to discover the origin of this ambiguity. As he finds out, it all begins with an ancient problem raised by Plato, namely the problem of division. Division refers to our capacity to establish distinctions in space and time, without which we would be unable to think and reason. Deleuze explains that there are four aspects to representation. There are four principal aspects to reason insofar as it is the medium of representation: identity in the form of the undetermined concept, analogy in the relation between ultimate determinable concepts, opposition in the relation between determinations within concepts, and resemblance in the determined object of the concept itself. These forms are like the four heads or the four shackles of mediation. These four aspects may seem quite obscure, but Deleuze presents them in relation to a genesis, precise moments in the history of philosophy. The first two moments go back to Plato and Aristotle, and the last two to Hegel and Leibniz. The history of conceptual division was inaugurated by Plato, who was the first philosopher to describe the problem of the relation between essences and appearances. Plato's originality is to formulate the problem in terms of an election. Since eternal essences are of a higher nature and can never be reached, we can only approach them to a certain degree. So Plato's question is this: given a certain eternal essence, who is closest to it? For example, given the essence of the king shepherd of man, who in the city of Athens resembles it the most, and thus deserves to be the leader? Is it the shoemaker, the baker, the doctor? As it turns out, Plato argues that it is the statesman. But the real problem is this: in order to find the best claimant for the position of earthly king shepherd of man, we must know what this essence is in itself. How is Plato going to do this? In effect, Deleuze explains, once the question of the claimants is reached, Plato's famous text, The Statesman, invokes the image of an ancient god who ruled the world and man. Strictly speaking, only this god deserves the name of shepherd, king of mankind. None of the claimants is his equal, but there is a certain care of the human community which devolves to the statesman par excellence, since he is the closest to the model of the archaic shepherd, God. The claimants find themselves, in a sense, measured according to an order of elective participation. So Deleuze's point here is that in order to determine an essence such as the king shepherd of man, Plato refers to the myth, the mythical archaic divinity, such that the process by which we decide who best corresponds to that essence will be, ultimately, an act of judgment in which we compare and rank many claimants. This is why Plato's philosophy has been called the philosophy of judgment. Its characteristic trait is to put claimants to the test and judge them accordingly. And so the first moment or aspect of representation is described as identity in the form of the undetermined concept. The second moment takes place with Aristotle, and this is really where problems begin. As Deleuze says, Aristotle indeed saw what is irreplaceable in Platonism, even though he made it precisely the basis of a criticism of Plato. The dialectic of difference has its own method, division, but this operates without mediation, without middle term or reason. It acts in the immediate and is inspired by the ideas rather than the requirements of a concept in general. Aristotle, just like Plato, would like to elect the best of all claimants, but he would like to find a method which does not rely on mythical figures, because those are vague. They can only produce judgments based on immediate inspiration rather than mediate reason. So Aristotle updates Plato's method of division by adding to it a reasonable mediation in the form of rational categories. The rational categories are things like quantity, quality, position, etc. And to understand why Aristotle introduces them, consider the following point. Aristotle, like Plato, would have agreed that the specificity of a thing, its particular difference, can only be understood in relation to what it is a part of. Division always implies the division of a greater identity, the genus, into its parts, which are called species. For example, when Aristotle defines man as reasonable animal, he specifies the genus animal with one particular trait or specification, which is reason. Thus he is able to mediate the specific human difference as the ability to reason. It makes man one animal species among many others. Of course, a problem immediately arises, namely to what genus is animal a species of? And then, what is this new genus a species of? Can I ultimately distinguish between things that have being and things that do not have being? That seems odd, and indeed Aristotle says no, it has to stop somewhere. By way of consequence, he is forced to introduce ultimate concepts, ultimate genuses, or rather genera, which are the categories. These categories contain a maximum of thinkable difference. They are the ultimate determinable concepts. As Deleuze says, Categories are not subject to the condition that they share an identical concept or a common genus. Remember the reason why being itself is not a genus. It is, Aristotle says, because differences are. Perhaps you can feel the problem that is taking shape here. With the categories, a fundamental inconsistency is introduced in the concept of being, by which being cannot be positively defined. It's not a genus and cannot be one. If the categories are the ultimate genera, then I cannot determine their common genus, and so I cannot define being. For example, I cannot really compare the being of the number 4 with the being of the color red, other than to say that they both exist in some vague way, that is, by analogy. And this is the key to this argument. In a philosophy that uses ultimate determinable concepts or categories, being can only be said by analogy. This is why Deleuze defines the second moment of representation as analogy in the relation between ultimate determinable concepts. Analogy is what introduces equivocity in being, this very same equivocity that leads to the fractured I and to the two definitions of repetition. So the act of mediation through the categories is the very aspect of Platonism that must be overturned. And Deleuze makes the following important observation. Here we find the principle which lies behind a confusion disastrous for the entire philosophy of difference. Assigning a distinctive concept of difference is confused with the inscription of difference within concepts in general. The determination of the concept of difference is confused with the inscription of difference in the identity of an undetermined concept. This is the sleight of hand involved in a propitious moment, which is Deleuze's term to describe the elective process. And perhaps everything else follows, the subordination of difference to opposition, to analogy and to resemblance, all the aspects of mediation. So Deleuze reveals something quite important here. This aspect of Platonism that we want gone, mediation and the subordination of difference, has a fairly simple mechanism. First, it creates an empty slot, the abstract concept of quantity, for example. Secondly, it makes this abstraction the condition for all or at least some experiences. So in this way, it reduces all the immediate differences of our empirical experiences to it. But this is a sleight of hand, it's a trick, because difference is then reduced to this concept rather than being seized in itself. It is only by analogy, abstractly. This problem is by no means limited to Plato and Aristotle. In fact, we find the very same issue much later, in particular with Leibniz and Hegel, who represent the next two moments of the history of conceptual division. But there is nonetheless an important difference between the ancient Greeks and the modern Germans. Namely that for the ancient Greeks, the categories were finite. They come out of nature, which is why Deleuze calls their version of representation organic, meaning that it relates to a centralized and finite organism, the cosmos. By contrast, the Germans will create infinite categories, producing a new type of representation which Deleuze calls, perhaps not without humor, orgiastic representation. Leibniz and Hegel both use one type of infinite, the infinitely small for Leibniz and the infinitely large for Hegel. But orgiastic representation does not solve the problem of the analogy of being. It very much perpetuates it. Neither Leibniz nor Hegel managed to seize difference in itself. Without entering into many details, let us just note how with Hegel, difference is seized as the limit that appears within an infinite opposition between a thing and its negation, such that a thing contains difference because it is essentially attached to the whole. Similarly, with Leibniz, difference is expressed as an infinite analysis, identical to differential analysis or calculus, which Leibniz co-discovered, and which is based on a convergence towards a presupposed identity within the concept itself. In both cases, however, difference is abstract. It's too vast to be seized in itself. As Deleuze says, the net is so loose that the largest fish pass through. So both organic and orgiastic representation maintain the ambiguity at the heart of being. Because they rely on categories, finite or infinite, they cannot predicate being other than by analogy, resemblance or opposition, all of which confuse the determination of the concept of difference with the inscription of difference in the identity of an undetermined concept. So the time has come for Deleuze to invoke another, much more turbulent family of thinkers, the true rebels of philosophy, who are the architects of the crucial concept of universality of being. Opposed to the venerable behemoths of philosophy, we find an extraordinary group of thinkers who have developed at length a special concept, the universality of being, which directly contradicts the philosophy of representation and categories. The first of them is Duns Scotus, a medieval monk who wrote, according to Deleuze, the greatest book of pure ontology, the Opus Oxoniense, the Oxford work. Simply put, Scotus's problem is this. God has a certain number of attributes like infinity, eternity, etc., while creatures, also called modes, as in modifications, do not have attributes, they are only modifications of these attributes, hence their name. But if we want to be able to say that infinite things are, and therefore can be understood, in the same sense that finite things are and can be understood, we need to reconciliate these two orders, otherwise we, as finite creatures, would be properly incapable of understanding God. Scotus's genius solution consists in saying that the attributes are adequate to both God and the creatures. From God's perspective, the attributes are abstract forms that do not compromise the divine simplicity, meaning the divine unity. From the other perspective, modes are simply understood as finite variations of these attributes, that is, finite things that can be distinguished modally by virtue of their mode of being, of their intensity. With these two distinctions, finite and modal, being can be said in the same sense of abstract and real things. However, the problem with this view is that being remains indifferent to the creatures. It contains them, but it does not produce them or affirm them, since it is God who produces them. We must wait for the second great representative of univocity, Spinoza, to arrive at the properly affirmative conception of being, in which the modes become part of the substance via the attributes, such that the modes are only indirectly caused by the substance, and the substance does not depend on the modes. That is to say, substance and modes have different essences. God's essence is the infinite number of his attributes, while the essence of the modes is a difference of intensity, that is, a modification of certain attributes. With Spinoza, the substance becomes active and affirms creatures into being, but it remains abstract nonetheless. It is only with Nietzsche in the 19th century that we approach the true univocity of being. Hence the following quote, which may be one of the most important passages in Difference and Repetition. Nevertheless, with Spinoza, there still remains a difference between substance and the modes. Spinoza's substance appears independent of the modes, while the modes are dependent on substance but as though on something other than themselves. Substance must itself be said of the modes and only of the modes. Such a condition can be satisfied only at the price of a more general categorical reversal according to which being is said of becoming. Identity of that which is different, the one of the multiple, etc. That identity not be first, that it exists as a principle but as a second principle, as a principle become, that it revolves around the different. Such would be the nature of a Copernican revolution which opens up the possibility of difference having its own concept rather than being maintained under the domination of a concept in general already understood as identical. Nietzsche meant nothing more than this by eternal return. In this sense, the eternal return is the latest stage in the history of univocity. It's the core of Nietzsche's philosophy of power, which is so called not because we want power over others, but because modes, you and I, ideas and objects, are defined by the unique degree of power that each of us express. We never cease to become who we are, because we're never done expressing our power. In eternal return, only the extreme forms return, those which, large or small, are deployed within the limit and extend to the limit of their power, transforming themselves and changing one into another. Only the extreme, the excessive, returns, that which passes into something else and becomes identical. In other words, with the eternal return, the classical distinction between essences and appearances finally disappears. Insofar as they express their power, modes make or produce difference. As modes change, so does the whole. This is quite exciting because we are finally in a position where we can define repetition in an adequate manner, that is, with difference as its essence. Repetition is the formless being of all differences, the formless power of the ground, which carries every object to that extreme form in which its representation comes undone. The ultimate element of repetition is the disparate, from the French dispart, which stands opposed to the identity of representation. Thus, the circle of eternal return, difference and repetition, which undoes that of the identical and the contradictory, is a tortuous circle in which sameness is said only of that which differs. The discovery of the eternal return now allows us to formulate being in a non-analogical manner. As Deleuze says, being is said in a single and same sense of everything of which it is said, but that of which it is said differs. It is said of difference itself. The eternal return radically changes three important concepts, namely negation, science, and experience. You may have noticed that negation appeared, though discreetly, in Aristotle's category as well as in Hegel. A thing is said to be what it is because it negates or differs from something else. But even though this negation constitutes the species or the identity of the thing, it does nonetheless presuppose a form of resemblance or identity on which the negation acts. To negate means to negate something. But negation, Deleuze argues, must be thought of as a consequence, rather than a condition of identity. With the eternal return, we're able to make difference a pure positivity, which contains no negation. Similarly, singular differences present themselves in a particular way that changes our usual understanding of what a sign is. Classically, we define signs as manifestations or traces of these essences that compose the higher world, which we can then induce. But in the univocal world, signs are not traces of a higher order, they are not copies of a model. Rather, they are what Deleuze calls simulacra, and a simulacrum is not an image, but an act of seizing a disparity, a multiplicity. The simulacrum is the sign so far as the sign interiorizes the conditions of its own repetition. The simulacrum seizes upon a constituent disparity in the thing from which it strips the rank of model. This does not mean that signs or simulacra are falsities or illusions. Quite the contrary, they manifest or express the essence of being, which is difference, to the highest level. This leads to the third point, actual experience. Classically, we ground experience in either the object itself, which impresses its reality on the senses, and to know something means to see it for what it is, which implies that it pre-exists as such, in essence. Or we ground experience in the subject, who then becomes the measure of all reality, such as in idealism. But Deleuze argues rather that experience fundamentally has no ground, it's ungrounded. Eternal return, affirmed in all its power, allows no installation of a foundation, ground. On the contrary, it swallows up or destroys every ground which would function as an instance responsible for the difference between the original and the derived, between things and simulacra. It makes us party to a universal ungrounding. So what Deleuze is saying here is that our reality is not grounded in mind or matter. We don't come from atoms or from a universal subject, but we become who we are in and through the expression of a power which contains no negation, which apprehends simulacra and in which experience is ungrounded. All of these points we will discuss again in the future. What matters for now is that we have become able to define the essence of repetition, that is, difference in itself. But important questions appear. For example, if our experience is ungrounded, without center or basis, then how can we fixate difference in repetition? How can we have a sense of identity at all? This is what we will discuss in our study of the next chapter, titled Repetition in Itself. For now, thank you for watching, and see you soon.